Hello everyone, and welcome to Mr. May's AP World History class, and today we're going to take a look at the revolutions of Latin America. Now in the beginning here, we're going to take a look at Haiti. Haiti we're going to take a look at first because it's going to be really the first and only successful slave revolt in history. Now Haiti was a colony of France, and it was being exploited for its economic gain, primarily that of sugarcane, as well as some other resources by the French. Now, it was very brutal life for the slaves on the plantations there. Harvesting sugarcane is very, very hard work, very, very tough and demanding work, especially in the climate of the Caribbean. Now, there are some issues going on that are actually going to help lead to a revolt in Haiti. One being the fact that life for the slaves is very, very brutal, but also two, you have the revolutionary ideas and the Enlightenment that the Haitians and the people on Saint-Domingue are actually going to witness and have experience with because of one, the American Revolution that is just in the backyard of Saint-Domingue, and the parent country of Haiti, France, is going through its own revolution as well. Now, the slaves on Haiti, they're going to escape the life that is that they're under in two ways. One, they're actually going to have a kind of a social or religious practice they use to kind of step away, and that is voodoo or vodun. And then the other one, and this is going to play a bigger role in terms of why the actual revolution takes place, is the concept of maroonage, where a lot of slaves are actually going to flee to the countryside and live on their own. And then ultimately you're going to see what they're going to do is they're going to organize their own groups to actually attack the plantation owners and attack the French. So while the French Revolution is kind of in full swing and starting to kind of develop into further stages, the revolt happened. The slaves actually revolt in Haiti in 1791, again with their inspirations being that of the American and French revolutions. Now, like I just said previously, the Maroons are going to lead bands in guerrilla warfare to actually attack the French and the slave plantation owners. Now, the British, being enemies of the French for a long period of time, big rivals politically and economically, as well as many other ways, they start to offer support to those rebelling against the French. Now, with their whole goal is they want to drive the French out and ultimately use that area for themselves if possible. Now, the situation on Haiti was very, very divided. You obviously had your whites, Frenchmen that were actually against the revolt. You had your slaves that were for it. And then you had a mixed race of people, mulattoes, both black and white, that were divided over not only the issue of slavery, but divided on which side to support. Now, the main leader of the revolution is Toussaint Louverture. Now, he is going to fight against slavery, and he's going to fight against the French. Now, he's going to get support from the Spanish crown, mainly because the other half of the island is owned by the Spanish, and that is where his initial support is going to come from. Now, his role is going to be a little complicated and very detailed, and I recommend you guys go read some stuff about him because he's a very interesting figure. But he's going to switch some sides, and there's going to be kind of some differences in terms of what he's going to do based on the actions that are going to take place. For example, when the French abolished slavery in all of their colonies, he actually switches sides, and then he fights the slave owners that are backed by the British, who were still offering support. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here. Now, we're going to go jump ahead a couple of years. In 1799, when Napoleon actually is kind of come into power in France, and the revolution is kind of transitioned and it's technically over, but you have Napoleon's kind of taking the lead. He is actually going to reinstate slavery in the colonies. He's going to dispatch about 20,000 troops to actually make sure that that actually takes place. Toussaint doesn't like this, given the fact that the French had already previously gotten rid of slavery. and eventually he's actually going to be imprisoned, and then eventually exiled to France, where he's actually going to die. Now, the rebellion is going to continue without him in various stages and various strength, but the French troops that are sent there to kind of quell this rebellion and make sure that slavery is reinstituted, they suffer drastically because of yellow fever. The tropical climate, they're not accustomed to it, and disease really, really gets them and knocks them down. And this all leads to the fact that Haiti is actually going to be able to proclaim their independence from the French and achieve a successful slave rebellion on January 1st of 1804. And again, like I said previously, this is really only the only successful slave revolt in history, is that of Haiti. Now, we're going to move on to abolition. So, over the period of the 1700s, with the Atlantic slave trade and actions going on in the colonies and all this different types of news going on, the idea of abolition is building in France and their colonies, in England, Spain, and even in the United States. Now, the abolition that we're talking about here is going to be different depending on who we're talking about. In Britain, they actually abolished the slave trade in 1807. Like I said previously, the French have abolished it, although it was reinstated by Napoleon, and then they obviously lose that again with the successful result of the slaves in Haiti. But those are those two imperial powers. Now, the United States, we actually abolished the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, in 1808, but we do not effectively abolish slavery in our country, and that ultimately led to the Civil War in 1861. Now, outside of these imperial powers and the United States, the Atlantic slave trade is going to continue in other parts of the world, and it will end a little bit later in the 19th century. And you can see there, it isn't until it ends in Brazil in 1888 that effectively the Atlantic slave trade and slavery there ends. So it does take some time. Now, as for some other independence movements that are happening in Latin America, they're going to be inspired by the American and French revolutions, and even more so by the Haitian Revolution, because these people see that people that are being subjugated by a colonial power or imperial power, like in France, can actually be successful. Now, the first real group that actually is going to revolt, and this is going to be before the Haitian Revolution, are the Amerindians and mestizos in the colonies of France, in the Spanish colonies. And you can see there you have Tupac Amaru is going to lead a revolt in Peru. It's not successful. There's going to be the Colombian Comunero revolt. It does achieve a little gains, at least initially, but again, it ends in internal fighting because they can't agree on who's going to lead, and as well as some other issues. But some other reasons for why some more revolts or movements actually take place in the Spanish colonies is not just the revolutions that we talked about previously, but the Napoleonic Wars that are going to happen in Europe and in some ways across the globe are going to open the door for independence movements. And you're going to have various people lead the way. Some are going to be very, very bloody, but ultimately there are going to be some successful revolts that we're going to look at. All right, now, the people that are going to benefit the most in these revolts, as you guys are going to see, are going to be that of the Creoles, who want independence, but they want to keep the old system that's in place. All right, so this leads us to Simon Bolivar of Colombia. And now, Simon Bolivar, he's going to be a very influential figure for the independence movements of Northern South America. And now, initially, he's going to suffer some setbacks. He's actually going to be exiled. While he's exiled, he writes what's called the Manifesto Cartagena, which is a rallying cry against the Spanish rulers. Now, he's going to come back to Colombia, and he is going to gain a significant army and undertake a campaign, or actually a series of campaigns against the Spanish, and defeat them, and establish the Republic of Colombia in 1819. Now, he has support from the Haitians, and as well as the British. Now, the British, again, are supporting him for the same reasons they supported the Haitians in the Haitian Revolution. Now, the various campaigns that Simon Bolivar is going to undertake is going to lead him to be able to create a significant territory that's under his control. You can see here by 1821 he's going to liberate Venezuela as well as Ecuador and establish a federation. He is going to even be able to extend his control further to the south and southwest in Peru and into Bolivia, what was called Upper Peru then. However, he's not going to be able to keep everything together because he's going to have warfare amongst his generals. And what that'll ultimately do is create an independence independence movement for each of the constituent units that are actually part of his federation. So like Bolivia is going to become Bolivia, Peru, and so forth. Now, his dream is he wanted to create this Grand Colombia, or take all of the territory that he had and have it as one kind of organized federation or organized empire of his own. Now, like I said, it's going to split, and it's going to split in very violent ways. There's going to be a lot of warfare and repression of the Indian population, the African populations there because of the slave systems the Spanish ran, and so forth. But ultimately what this was going to do is, because since he fails to hold this Grand Colombia together, you're going to have these caudillos, or military strongmen, that are going to lead not only the national armies once they break apart, but as well as private armies from these very wealthy politicians and wealthy plantation owners that live in Grand Colombia, where they're going to ultimately gain control and run these countries. And this effect of these caudillos and the breakup of Grand Colombia are going to play huge roles in kind of the political and military history of South America, not just in the rest of the 1800s, but into the 20th century as well. And you're still seeing some of the effects today. Alright, so here you guys get a chance to see the revolutions of Latin America on a bigger scale through these two maps. Now, on the left you have Latin America in 1800, and here is Saint Domingue, and they're going to gain their independence in 1804. Now, you can see that the majority of southern and western South America is owned by the Spanish, and then all the way up through Central America and in the western part of the United States, west of the Mississippi, is also owned by the Spanish. Now, by 1830, which is really not that long of a period of time, all these places, for the most part, are going to become independent, with a few exceptions, like British Honduras, Jamaica, some of the Caribbean islands, and then the Guianas. But that is going to be a huge change that is going to take place. Now, we're going to touch on most of these, and in particular, like I said, we just talked about Saint Domingue, and then we just talked about that of the movements of Grand Colombia. So let's move on to Mexico. And so the Mexican Revolution is going to be led by these two men that you see here, Miguel Hidalgo and Jose Maria Morelos. Now, they're seeking, again, kind of the same thing as these other movements. They want to kick the Spanish rule out. They think they're subjugated, very harsh, as well as that of the Creoles that are in society. They think they're only kind of prospering for their gain and not the rest of the society. They also want to abolish slavery as well, and kind of revoke some of the privileges of the church, because the church is put really in power by the Spanish. Now, Mexico is going to be able to achieve independence in 1821. And it's not going to be a smooth transition for them, because there's going to be a huge struggle for power that's going to ensue, really, in various times from 1821 into the early 1900s, and that ultimately is going to lead to a huge loss of territory for Mexico when they at least when they gain their initial independence. The first area where they lose independence is the Central American countries, like El Salvador, and so forth, Belize, around there. They break away and form an actual union, but again, that union fails for the same reasons, and that breaks apart. Another area where they're going to lose territory is in Texas. Now, Texas, the American farmers and settlers had been moving into that territory, extending westward in the United States. They eventually declare war and break away from Mexico. They're going to fight a war. As most of you guys know, the famous Battle of the Alamo in San Antonio was a part of this. Now Texas is going to be able to declare their independence, but because of issues with Mexico, they're going to kind of link themselves back up with the United States, which again further causes problems for Mexico, because America is not only pushing for manifest destiny, but they're moving westward. They're trying to kind of set themselves up on the grander stage of the world, become more powerful. So they kind of get at loggerheads over a variety of issues, and in particular, this ends up leading to what we call the Mexican-American War in 1846. Now, this is not a very long war, but Mexico is going to lose this war, and Texas is going to be annexed by the United States. And that war, it ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and this is going to lead to even further loss for Mexico, where they're not just going to lose Texas, but they're going to lose, or they're going to keep, Texas is going to stay away from them, but they're also going to lose the rest of what we consider the southwestern part of the United States. And you guys can see here what I'm talking about. So you have the Republic of Texas, which was established in 1836, and this is going to be annexed by the United States once they're victorious in the Mexican-American War. But then with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and then eventually the Gadsden Purchase, these Mexican cessions of territory lead to them losing a huge part of what was their territory after they gained independence. And this just so happens that this is the border that we have today with Mexico, at least in terms of after the Gadsden Purchase that we share today. All right, now on to Brazil. Now, Brazil is, of all these independence movements that we've talked about so far, is the only nonviolent movement for independence. Now, there's a variety of reasons for this. So let's go back to Portugal, the home base, the mother country of Brazil. So Napoleon, during the Napoleonic Wars, is invading and undertaking campaigns all over Europe and the Mediterranean world at various stages. But in 1807, he invades Portugal. Now, the royal family of the Portuguese government, they flee just hours before French troops get to their palace in Lisbon, and they flee to Rio de Janeiro. Now, what ends up happening is when they flee, they decide, King Dom decides that he's going to make the legal status of Brazil equal to that of Portugal, because he sees for the foreseeable future this is where he's going to be, because most people think that Napoleon is going to be successful. Now, in 1821, King Dom returns to Portugal, but what he ends up doing is, instead of having the entire family return, he leaves his son Pedro in charge of the country. Now, this leads to him to set up and kind of rule his own empire, in effect, separate from his father, even though it's technically part of the Portuguese Empire. So ultimately, Pedro declares independence in 1821. Okay, now this leads to Brazil becoming independent. And the reason why Portugal doesn't go after it is there's a couple of reasons. One, because it's his son, King Dom's son is in control. And two, they just don't really have the power. They're not as powerful as they were in the previous century. All right, so to finish up, we're going to look at some of the issues that came out of or were expanded upon because of these independence movements. So, first off, religion. You start to see a suppression of the authority and wealth of the Catholic Church within these areas, because the Catholic Church, especially in the case of that of Spain, or the Spanish colonies, was proliferating the Spanish power. And with them getting pushed out, their role changes. Now, that does not mean that religion is dead in those areas. It just means that the role or the authority of the Catholic Church changes. The economic systems are going to change as well. Obviously, if you look at that of the Haitian Revolution, slavery is not going to be there after they gain independence. If you look at in terms of like the actual systems in place in the Spanish areas, such as that of the hacienda, which is a rural estate run by the Creoles and farmed by Native Americans and mestizos, that's going to change, although ultimately that's not really going to be change all that much. It's going to be very similar to, like, if you know anything about American history, where in the South, after slavery was effectively abolished, you end up having the sharecropper system that takes place in the South, where technically people weren't slaves anymore, but for all intents and purposes they still were. You still kind of see that economically happen, especially in Brazil and in the Spanish colonies as well. Now, in some cases it'll change, but for the most part that's there. And it's because of the power system that was already in place. I mean, people have wealth, and you have people coming from nothing, so they don't really have much to go off of, and they have to achieve something to kind of change their status. But ancestry is going to play a huge role as well. Now, you're going to have neocolonialism is going to become a factor, mainly because essentially you have all of these states gain independence, but they've pushed out the people that were in power. They don't really have the ability to run their countries effectively. We've seen it in terms of, like, Mexico's not able to control all of their land. They have internal struggles, or that of Gran Colombia. So you essentially have colonialism with independence. And Britain is going to be the main country that is going to be the colonial power that's going to really control much of the trade of Latin America, because they can give what the Latin Americans want. They need trade partners, but ultimately they're still under control of another foreign power, and that of the British, because they have the economic kind of capital and control that these Latin American countries just can't compete with. All right, and lastly, besides neocolonialism, economics, and religion, the philosophies and practices that are developed across these Latin American countries once they gain independence are very, very different. In one area you could have democracy and liberty, but in another you could have somebody just as bad or even worse take power than that of the Europeans that were previously there. So there's really kind of this diverse mixture of really what happens in these areas out of the independence movements. And that is going to play itself out in a variety of ways throughout the rest of the 18th century and into the 1800s, and then into the 1900s. You're going to see certain wars that are going to take place between many of the South American countries. You're going to see America get involved in a variety of conflicts. You guys might hear of them called the Banana Wars, as well as some other things that are going to take place because of this diversity and all the actions that happen post-independence for these countries and independence movements that we talked about. Now, these revolutions are very, very influential. They don't get as much press as that of the French Revolution or the American Revolution, but they do play a huge role on the world stage, and how the history of the Western Hemisphere plays out from this point on. And you're still seeing the effects of them today in really every aspect of life that you can take a look at. All right, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope it was really informative, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Have a good night.